In the face of widespread public violence and looting, ongoing load shedding, and what feels like a never-ending pandemic, there is one clear consistency: the complete lack of leadership from our national ministers, who have failed to lead us through one crisis after the other and left South Africa hanging by a thread. Big changes will need to be made to SA, not just to the cabinet, but to government policy, if we are going to get the country back on track. Let's imagine that those changes can be made. Imagine, as we found out this week, that the ANC is polling under 50% of the vote at the moment. And so it is possible to break the ANC's lock on the country's potential. During this winter of discontent, we discuss what changes can be made to restore confidence in the future of South Africa. But first, we take a look at the week in headlines.
After nearly a month of tougher restrictions, South Africa is now on adjusted lockdown level 3.
It's been a challenging year for the restaurant sector, to say the least. The industry has had to readjust the way it operates, depending on lockdown restrictions.
With many having closed since the initial lockdown last year, now more are facing the same fate.
We're urging government to level with us when they make this type of decisions that really have a dire impact on our livelihoods.
South Africans should brace themselves for more load shedding over the next 5 years.
The taxi industry is the lifeblood of the township economy, but the recent murders and attacks of innocent people have tainted its image. Some routes have now been closed, but taxi bosses are defiant.
The DA is extremely proud and excited to announce that we will be submitting 2 bills to Parliament, which will effectively establish a new Chapter 9 institution.
This has to be a good thing for South Africa. It has to be a good thing for the rule of law. And the sooner it is done, the better.
South Africa is emerging from the destruction and widespread looting that has cost us several hundreds of lives. So many people have been left puzzled at the lack of action from authorities, and no one seems to take accountability.
This week in the headlines, South Africa moves to level 3 lockdown. The DA calls on Ramaphosa to testify before a parliamentary inquiry into the ANC-sponsored anarchy. And the DA-led Western Cape takes further steps to become load-shedding free. But first, the DA, partnering with civil society organisation Accountability Now, have announced our intention to introduce a brand new Chapter 9 corruption-busting institution. It will be called the Anti-Corruption Commission, and it will operate independently, with its main objective being to investigate high-level, large-scale corruption cases. The establishment of this commission is a bold and unprecedented proposal by the DA. We call on civil society and parties across the political spectrum to support us in this crucial battle in the war on corruption. The DA welcomes the relaxation of some restrictions as South Africa moves to alert level 3 lockdown. But the president should have gone further and removed all restrictions that are costing South Africans their jobs. The curfew and the ban on alcohol should have been lifted completely. It is now clear that the curfew especially is doing irreparable damage to restaurants, to small towns, and the entire tourism industry. The continued restrictions are also chipping away at tax revenues of government and crushing employment opportunities. As there is no end in sight for irrational announcements under this lockdown rule by the ANC, the DA calls for Parliament to be reconvened urgently to find solutions to the serious challenges battering South Africa. We welcome reports that Parliament is pursuing an inquiry into the ANC's sponsored anarchy that devastated large parts of KZN and Gauteng. But the DA believes that this probe will only be legitimate if President Ramaphosa is the first person to testify before it. The DA has also filed an urgent application under the PIA Act to gain access to the supposed intelligence report that Minister Glodlo claims to have handed to police before the riots broke out. It is critical that South Africa knows the who, the when, and the what of this catastrophic failure of our security cluster to protect citizens and property. If the president won't take us into his confidence, we will be compelled to go to court to force him to be honest with South Africans. The DA has condemned the taxi violence that has disrupted the Western Cape public transport sector. The war between taxi associations has resulted in senseless deaths and have left many commuters stranded. The provincial government has taken drastic steps to restore law and order, and this has included the closing of the disputed taxi route to all taxis. The safety of commuters remains the first priority of the Western Cape government, and the ongoing violence will not be tolerated. The DA will continue to fight the Employment Equity Amendment Bill. The bill seeks to give government the power to set racial targets for each sector of the economy. Government. The DA strongly opposes this bill as it amounts to dogmatic racial bean counting. The bill will deter investment at a time when every rand of investment is desperately needed. For this reason, we are calling for a comprehensive socio-economic impact assessment to be done on the bill before it goes any further. And finally, as South Africans were turned off by yet another bout of load shedding, the DA Western Cape government has announced a project to help municipalities to generate or buy their own electricity. This will ensure that residents of Western Cape municipalities can break free from the Eskom monopoly. As the ANC national government fails to keep the lights on, the DA Western Cape is set to become the first province in South Africa to become load-shedding free. Moving on to the Spotlight feature this week, we look at what changes can be made to the cabinet and government policy to restore confidence in the future of South Africa. Let's take a look at the story in the Spotlight.
The question we are asking tonight is, what are the underlying factors that have led to the rampant looting and violent unrest we saw last week? And what is the way forward for President Cyril Ramaphosa?
Calls are mounting for the ministers to be held accountable.
337 people dead.
That is a public emergency that nobody in authority in this country has taken responsibility for.
I see all the signs of a failing state. And yet we've had a situation where government knew that this was going to happen. And if they didn't know it was going to happen, they should be fired.
What is becoming evidently clear is that a parliamentary inquiry into the occurrences of the last week will have to be seriously considered.
How do we move forward from this to prevent exactly that happening again?
We need to fix this and fix it properly. But unless our leadership deal with the real underlying issues, we will sit here forever and a day not unlocking the potential that this country has.
All we want from the top is ethical leadership and good governance.
Not a cabinet reshuffle, a cabinet spring clean.
To be able to restore peace and law and order in the country and to make sure that we can move forward from this.
In 2015, the political commentator and historian R.W. Johnson wrote that the ANC lacks the ability to run even a mid-sized town, let alone a modern industrial economy. I mean, Luthuli House doesn't even know who's on its payroll. If you weren't quite convinced of how badly President Cyril Ramaphosa was doing, then the events of the past 3 weeks have probably changed your mind. If there was ever a time for a president to pivot, to admit that his government's policies aren't working, that the cabinet ministers appointed to operate the machinery of the state were dangerously incompetent, now is the time. On Sunday, the president could have made a turnaround. He could have fired the ministers of police and state security for failing to prevent the looting and destruction that led to the loss of life and the economic devastation of large parts of the country. He could have fired the energy minister for sabotaging reforms needed to end load shedding. He could have announced a review of BEE, expropriation without compensation, and other policies that have kept 40% of South Africans out of work. Not only is the so-called security cluster still in place, the Digital Vibes report is still under wraps, and the health minister is still on paid special leave. In the meantime, a thoroughly mediocre tourism minister runs the vaccine program. We know that the president didn't clean up his cabinet and he didn't pivot to pro-growth, pro-jobs policies. Nothing of meaning has been done to restore public trust in state institutions or in the confidence of the future of the country, even before the pandemic. and the looting, poverty and malnutrition was a reality in many households, and now food insecurity is the next big crisis that we face. But the DA is here to light a candle, not to curse the darkness, so to speak. We care about this country and its people, and we're determined to use every opportunity to build a better South Africa and to get things done. To discuss all of this, we are joined in studio by DA Shadow Minister for Finance, Geordin Hill-Lewis, DA Shadow Justice Minister, Glynnis Breytenbach, and on Zoom, the DA's Head of Policy, Gwen Ngwenya. Welcome, folks, to the Inside Track. Geordin, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Cilliers.
So the Cabinet is the engine room of decision-making of government in the country. But it seems that that engine room is malfunctioning badly. What is going on?
It seems, Cilliers, great to be with you and Glynnis and Gwen. It seems, Cilliers, that our Cabinet is typified by paralysis. And really that has to be a leadership problem. As you said in your introduction, we've got a number of very mediocre, unqualified Cabinet ministers who are clearly not up to the job. They have huge responsibility in defence, in policing, in keeping citizens safe, and just are not up to it. But you've got a president, really, who appoints these ministers and who is responsible for holding them accountable and for directing their work, who is just not doing that. And so we have rather minor things, comparatively to what we've seen in KZN, like major policy disputes that take months to get resolved, for example, in electricity between ministers, no resolution of those, to really life and death things like we saw in KZN, where you've got ministers responsible for protecting communities just totally absent and inept. And really, the buck has to stop with the president. He appoints these ministers. They serve at his pleasure. It is his cabinet. And that's why I love the phrase that you used, we need a clean-out. We've got to get rid of some of the most inept, unaccountable, and clearly incapable, and really get some capable leadership into our cabinet. Until we can do that, we can't really see these critical departments and state functions turning around. The quality of leadership just isn't there.
And obviously changes will have to be made beyond just cleaning out the cabinet, more fundamental changes. Glynnis, I want to come to you. You've taken the lead in the DA's proposal for an anti-corruption commission. Now, many South Africans look at all of the law enforcement and constitutional institutions that we have, and what they're saying is, but when are we going to get to the point where we put people in jail as a sign that the criminal justice system is working and that there are consequences for criminal conduct? So what makes the proposed anti-corruption commission different?
Well, it's precisely, Cilliers, and good morning, it's precisely because the criminal justice system is not working that we have come to the point where we propose this anti-corruption commission. The National Prosecuting Authority has not prosecuted one corruption case of significance in the last 10 years. That leads to not only nobody wearing orange overalls, it also leads to a lack of experience of prosecutors. They have no opportunity to build up experience because they're not doing that job. The Hawks, the DPCI, Directorate of that replaced the DSO, have a serious have a serious capacity problem. They have a serious capacity constraint. They're running on 46% of their staff complement, and they have 76,000 outstanding dockets. At 46% of your staff complement, with that kind of backlog, you're not going to get the job done. And we've seen that in the last 5 years, nobody who is of any significance has been prosecuted. There have been 1 or 2 arrests, but that's not hard to do. Nobody has been prosecuted for anything, so there have been no consequences. And for that reason, we have now proposed this anti-corruption commission to alleviate the burden on that part of the criminal justice system, allow them to carry on with the business that they're meant to do on a daily basis, and to give effect to the Glynnis judgment in the Constitutional Court, where the court found that setting up the mechanism to set up the Hawks is unconstitutional. They're not sufficiently independent. So they don't replace the scorpions. They've been moved into the police precisely because that gives some political control. And we've seen what the result of that is. So an independent Chapter 9 institution that is beyond the reach of politics, similar to the role the DSO played, with complete independence, answerable to the courts, and then go after grand corruption on a very, very large scale, with a multidisciplinary team capable of doing those investigations and prosecutions. Of course, always in cooperation and collaboration with the National Prosecuting Authority. They are the prosecuting authority and they can be the only one. And this isn't meant to replace them. But certainly it will alleviate that burden, allow them to get on with their job. And there are many, many, many competent, qualified people out there who are not currently employed within the criminal justice system because of the politics of the criminal justice system, that are dying to get involved in prosecuting this kind of thing. So I have no doubt that it can be very successful.
And given the Glynnis judgment, as you mentioned, and the changes that clearly need to be made, we're obviously eager to see how the ANC and government will respond to this proposal.
Well, the ANC, of course, have made their own announcement about some sort of body that they want to form to investigate this type of thing, but they've taken no real steps. They've made no concrete proposals. And we believe the Anti-Corruption Commission will fill that gaping hole in the criminal justice system, will allow them to repair themselves. And we hope that the ANC will come on board. I think the best chance of these pieces of legislation being successful is to try and get it through Parliament as a committee bill. And it's not about making a noise, it's about making a difference. So it doesn't matter who or how it gets through. If we can do it in cooperation, collaboration with each other, so much the better.
So, Geordin, this is part of what the DA has tried to do. In the beginning of this year, John Steenhuisen said in Parliament, here is our economic reform program. We are willing to help reformers on the government side to make fundamental changes to the budget and to the economy. So tell us what needs to be done to get South Africa back on a track of growth and to raise levels of social mobility.
Well, so let me just start with social mobility. This is the idea that you can actually lift people out of dire circumstances of poverty and give them lives of dignity and value. That's what we really believe in as the DA. We want people to feel a sense of social mobility, that they can uplift over time their lives.
And that nobody is doomed. We can do something about our circumstances.
And Cilliers, there is only one tried and tested way to do that, and that is growth, growth, growth. We have to grow this economy. And so long as South Africa has got other priorities that supersede the growth imperative, then we will continue to see greater poverty, greater unemployment, and the lack of the social mobility you speak of. So as the DA, we obsess about growth and getting people into work. And wherever we are in government, we try to help make it as easy as possible for businesses to function, to grow, to run a business. And we've got to do that on a national scale. But our government at the moment is so obsessed with other political debates inside their party, inside the ANC, destructive and distracting debates around land, for example, and expropriation. Growth is way down on the government's agenda, the ANC's agenda, and the consequences are there for all to see. Now on reform, if you really want to get serious about growth, you cannot do that without electricity. That's a no-brainer. And so we've started to see a little bit of movement after years of load shedding, nearly 15 years of load shedding. We've started to see a little bit of reform-minded movement from the government on power, but
kicking and screaming.
Kicking and screaming, exactly. And only after massive fighting and debate. So that's why the insert in your little news bulletin was so important, because where we are in government, we've actually got to try and break that Eskom monopoly as quickly as we can. Not just in the Western Cape, but wherever we're in government. and then do the basics that governments have got to do to make the economy function. You can't run an economy without water, without lights, without functioning infrastructure. And those are the things that DA governments are really good at focusing on. There are some places in the country, Cilliers, as you will well know, coming from Tshwane, that where the DA has taken over, the rot has been so bad for so long that things are beyond repair. You've got to rebuild them from the ground up.
And that certainly takes a lot of time.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of money. And this goes to, let me just finish with the point about budgets and finances. It goes to the point that Glynnis has just made. When you've got a criminal justice system operating on less than half of its staff complement, because you've been squeezing those budgets down for so many years, where's the money going to? It's going to pay off your enormous debt bill. We're spending so much on paying off the credit card, we don't have money to pay prosecutors to bust the corrupt and get them into jail.
Debts incurred by those state-owned entities.
And that is why the basic, good old-fashioned principle of disciplined finances is so important to everything else that we've spoken about to get the economy growing again. And that is what the DA stands for.
Gwen, talking about ministers who have to be dragged kicking and screaming, as Geordin just referred to, that's not the only problem with our cabinet, is it? We've got a massive cabinet, many ministers compared to even developed countries such as Germany and the UK. Why is the issue of a big cabinet such an impediment to establishing a capable state?
Well, firstly, I think we need to look at, start with that point about South Africa having a big cabinet, because I think some might say, well, what are you talking about? When Ramaphosa was elected, he reduced the size of the cabinet from 36 ministers to 28. And so undoubtedly there was some movement in that direction. However, despite reducing it by 8 ministers, South Africa does remain one of the most bloated cabinets in the world. So the countries you have just mentioned, but also, just so looking at countries of similar size, I think is an important point as well, that this includes Germany, Turkey, the UK, Brazil, Nigeria, all countries with larger populations than South Africa, but with substantially fewer cabinet members. Now, the reason for why a small cabinet might be important is, obviously the main one that people talk about or immediately think about is the cost factor. So each minister, and including the deputy ministers, and I think quickly that's an important point to include as well, is that the deputy ministers are not technically part of the cabinet, but they are important to consider in our analysis because there's actually more of them than there even are ministers in a scenario where probably some ministries actually shouldn't need deputies. So it's important to recognize from a cost perspective that each of these ministers and deputy ministers are costing the country over 2 million rand a year each. But besides from the cost factor, because in relative budget sized terms, some people might say, well, look, I think we have to count every penny. But in general, besides cost, it's important because of the political culture that it sets. A lot of these positions exist purely not because of efficiency reasons, but as a source of patronage for the governing party. So as a way to reward allies. Particularly to reward allies, to settle scores and to appease factional battles within the governing party. So it instills, the wrong political culture within our politics. But also it's a terrible way for the government to set the example or to take the lead. In an economic environment, when households are tightening their belts, when businesses have to justify every line item of expenditure, it is unacceptable for the national government and for any government to behave as though it were the court of Versailles. And so that's an important point to keep in mind as well. But then lastly, also around efficiency, that the potential for smaller governments is that we can align departments with similar interests or where their policy mandates overlap and have them reporting under the same ministry for a much more clearer policy agenda and for much better and effective policy implementation. So there's also those efficiency considerations to take into consideration.
Thanks, Gwen. On the last 2 episodes of the Insight Track, we've been focusing on these terrible events that have shaken South Africa, the looting and the violence. And we spoke to Moeletsi Mbeki before, the commentator. And what he said is that the failure of government's economic policy is a contributor to the chaos that hit the country. And he specifically mentioned BEE. And I think he's one of the few commentators who is willing enough to be candid about that issue. Tell us, Gwen, what is the DA's alternative to the failures that we've seen in government?
I think I want to start off by saying that it's important to recognize that South Africa is a deeply unequal country. And of course, many might say, well, the goal obviously people cannot be made to be entirely equal. But when the inequality is as deep and across as many areas as you find in South Africa, it means that people are trapped in a cycle of deprivation. It means that people are born into circumstances which they are unable to escape in their lifetime. And as a party, as we've highlighted earlier, that deeply believes in providing people with the basic opportunities and capabilities to live a life of their choosing, it means that such an environment is completely contrary to everything that we stand for. So that's the principal basis about why we care about this historical legacy of inequality in South Africa. The policy then begins by looking at, well, if we care so deeply about inequality, we need to understand what the key drivers or constituents of inequality are in South Africa. Let's not speak in these vague terms about BE and scorecards and, well, what are the specific things that we are looking to address if we want to ensure that we address inequality? And this is not something that we have to thumbsuck. There's extensive research and studies done on the drivers of inequality in South Africa. The data is there. So we know that it's driven by poverty. Over 55% of South Africans currently live in poverty. It's driven by mass unemployment. So 43% of South Africans are unemployed, including those who have been discouraged to look for work. It's driven by factors such as well as poor nutrition and poor healthcare. We know 1 in 4 children in South Africa are stunted before the age of 5 years old. This has enormous lifelong consequences to the ability of those individuals, those young children, to learn, to become socially integrated individuals, and it also impacts on their economic opportunities later in life. So before the age of 5, to some extent, that person's life has been determined as one with lifelong lower chances than anyone else who was able to avoid being stunted by the age of 5 years old. We also historically have a problem of broken families. Now, we're not here to prescribe the type of family unit one should have, but the support and stability that a sound family environment provides is equally important. And we know that in parts, this does have structural roots back to apartheid that enforced a migratory system of labor that really separated families, etc. And we see some of those results still today, where we know that 43% of children live with 43% of children live only with their biological mother. Only 2% of children live only with their biological father. And you actually have 19% of children below the age of 4 years old, if I'm not mistaken, who live with neither parent. And the situation becomes worse as they get older. So you have all of these known drivers of inequality. And what does the linchpin or the main economic empowerment policy for the country have to say about these areas? Absolutely nothing. You will not find anywhere in BE empowerment policy that addresses or speaks to these drivers of inequality that we have just identified. BE has nothing to offer in terms of how to address poverty. It has nothing to offer in terms of how we should address the poor educational outcomes of our education system. It has nothing to say about how we address the breakdown of the family. It has nothing to say about how we improve childhood stunting and don't condemn people to lifelong poor opportunities. There's nothing at all in the central economic empowerment policy of the country that actually speaks to the things which have been identified as the key drivers and constituents of inequality. So first and foremost, if our policy does anything at all, is that it reorientates the focus of economic empowerment policy to the drivers of inequality. So you will find a great deal mentioned in our policy about what exactly, well, diagnosing firstly the challenges in each of these areas, and then providing solutions to what we can do to address poverty, unemployment, inequalities in healthcare, etc. I don't think in this show, I can go through them all, but I think it's very important to just have the takeaway message that the first thing that needs to be done is reorientating the focus of empowerment policy away from elite enrichment to the things that will truly lead to broad-based economic inclusion. And those are the very things that form the subject matter of our economic empowerment policy.
So Gwen, the ANC approach and BEE is to, in essence, create this elite who are often politically connected individuals, and they enjoy benefits almost as proxies for the rest of the South African people. The DA has come up with its own economic justice policy. Why do you think there is such resistance to alternative DA policies when we point to the failure that has brought us to this point? Why are commentators and often business folk so resistant to any alternative to the existing policy?
I think it's a number of reasons. I can't discount one actually just being willful ignorance. There are some people who refuse to understand, even when the answer is as plain as daylight. But aside from those reasons, if we look at some of the more, if we take it in good faith and look at some of the genuine concerns, I think one of the concerns is that is a belief that most Africans want race-based policies and that this would be a difficult sell. I cannot tell you how many times, especially in a more sort of educated or a higher income audience, the concern will be, well, that sounds all well and good what you're saying, and it sounds like a fantastic policy approach. However, this is not going to fly in South Africa. So people abstract it from themselves. They don't say, well, I agree, and therefore I'm now going to be a champion of this kind of policy elsewhere. They don't see their role as then, well, going out there and persuading people this is the right way to move. They then say, actually, there's no way we can sell this to others. So I think, one, if we can actually continue to demonstrate that this is a policy approach that enjoys broad support throughout variety of stakeholders in the country. So if we look at the surveys conducted by the Institute of Race Relations, and also there's a survey that's done by the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, these kind of surveys that are carried out continuously show that most Africans do not support race-based policies as an approach to transformation. And I can understand why, because clearly your race does not change no matter how empowered you become. So it's this massive lacuna that opens up the opportunity for the politically connected, for economic elites to benefit on behalf of poorest Africans purely on the basis of their shade skin color. So I think most Africans recognize that BE has not helped them. And you see that when you ask the Africans, has BE benefited you personally? Has BE benefited anyone you know in your community? The answers are overwhelmingly that no, it hasn't. Most people cannot identify how they personally have been assisted. And this is not just anecdotal. We don't have to only rely on what people say in surveys and focus groups, because I know people will say, well, there's always these challenges and how a survey is structured and how the question is asked. But let's move away from the technicalities of surveying and focus groups. The data that I presented earlier about the numbers, certainly the numbers don't lie. It doesn't take a rocket science to know that if your central economic empowerment policy has been in place for as long as it has in South Africa, and yet your poverty levels are as high as they are, your unemployment levels are as high as they are, your educational outcomes are as low as they are, the numbers don't lie. So even without talking to people, we know that this policy approach does not work, and people are aware that it does not work. So I think if we can get behind the fact that this is not something we actually need to convince most ordinary South Africans about, this is really an issue that those who are in a position of influence, thought leaders or the public intelligentsia, however you want to call it, but those who are in a capacity where they talk to others, where they influence others, that it's really that group or cohort that has to get on board and who has to be educated about the real levels of support of such a policy approach. And I think they're wrong about attitudes of most Africans when it comes to non-racial policy.
Geordin, surely all bets are now off. I mean, we've seen the extent of government failure. Confidence in the state is shaken.
Yes.
Do you think this is an opportunity for the DA to make a breakthrough with alternatives, given that what the ANC has offered the country has not worked?
I actually really do. I do see opportunity in this mess, Cilliers, and I think it's perfectly summarized by what you and Gwen have just said. This is the difference between us and the ANC. It is now so clearly put on display for every South African voter to see. The DA sees the state as a means to uplift people, improve their lives over time and expand opportunities to improve society. The ANC sees the state as a vehicle for elite enrichment. That really is the difference, and that is so clear now. The consequences also are becoming clearer and clearer as investors flee, as people feel increasingly desperate and turn even to violence, as we have seen. So while it's very upsetting and distressing, I also do see the opportunity now for more and more South Africans to see, well, let's put our faith behind a party and a government that actually has a proven track record of uplifting people's lives, improving their lives and opportunities, and getting the basic tasks of government done over time. And let's not continue to put our faith in a government who has shown only an interest in elite enrichment and, when South Africans needed them most, abandoned them to violence and anarchy.
Glynnis, I just want to get to you. One of the important elements of the type of society that we envision here is law and order, and that there should be consequences for criminal conduct. You lodged complaints of incitement to violence against members of the Zuma family and certain political leaders during the looting. Have you heard any progress on those charges?
I actually have, yes. The police have assigned, the Hawks have assigned 2 very senior investigators who have been to see me twice. They show a great interest in this investigation. I know that they are working hard on it. They keep me reasonably updated. They've appointed very competent cyber forensic experts to help them in this investigation, and I know that they've collected a large body of data already for analysis. So they're taking it very seriously. I'm very happy with the progress they're making, and they constantly keep me in the loop. So I'm very optimistic that those charges will actually go somewhere.
Some good news.
Can I ask a follow-up question, if I may, Glynnis? Nearly 2 weeks ago, we heard from the President's mouth that the government knew who the so-called instigators of this insurrection were, and that they were working on nabbing them.
Yes.
Where are they?
Well, one wonders if they're existing. If they know who they are, then why haven't they arrested him? They brought one person in for questioning and promptly let him go. So either there are no 12 instigators, or they have no idea what happened. And if we look at the ministers in charge of the security cluster, then I go with the second option. They have no idea what happened.
So it's interesting just to note that the only people who have actually faced serious charges resulting from this are the people who Glynnis and the DA laid charges against. There have still been no formal charges from the government.
And despite what the President has said. So certainly, they talk about ANC-sponsored chaos. Gwen, I want to get back to you. You wrote a piece about the parallel state. So as the state's ability to deliver basic services has deteriorated, we see more and more people relying on private education, private healthcare, private security. But then the irony is that the ANC seems to want to shut down this parallel state because anything that works and is not centrally controlled must be bad. What do you think government must do to respond to the parallel state and to make sure that the services that need to be delivered are delivered?
It's important to recognize, Cilliers, that not everyone might necessarily be convinced of the existence of the parallel state to begin with. So I just want to start by just saying that in South Africa, it it is still possible to travel to and from work or places of leisure reliably. It is still possible to get a globally competitive education. It is still possible to see a health practitioner when you need one. And it is also possible to call an armed response. But the important thing here is that all of that is made possible by private companies. If you are relying solely on state-provided services, you cannot make the above claims. You cannot possibly claim, I would dare to say, anywhere where you live in South Africa, outside of the Western Cape, certainly not where these are national competencies, can you say that you can reliably call on the South African Police Service when you are in danger. You cannot say that you are guaranteed a globally competitive education, regardless of the public school that you go to. You cannot say that you can rely on public transport, etc. So to any extent that you can rely on these services, it is because you're relying on a private provider. You have a private security system installed in your home. Perhaps you also rely on your local neighborhood watch. You send your child to an independent school. You go to a private clinic or see a private GP. All of these things are now made possible or reliably by the private parallel state. And I think it's also important to state that this is not some kind of rich or elite bubble. Increasingly, people across income groups are making use of these private services when they can, and already are doing so. So just to run through some examples I think is important is when we look at transport, look at public transport, and over 68% of public transport trips are conducted by the taxi industry. It's not funded by government, it's not subsidized by government, so it's definitely, it's public transport, but it's privately owned and operated. The public forms of, or the public service delivered public transport, like buses and trains, make up the minority constituents of transport trips, of trips to and from work in South Africa. Again, if you look at healthcare, often I think people are confused by the number of people who actually do access the private healthcare system, because we tend to look at medical aid membership, which is around, I think, 17% of South Africans have private medical aid. But that's the wrong way to look at it, because not everyone who accesses the private medical system necessarily does so via their medical aid. So when you start to look at actually doctor's appointments and consultations, there you start actually starting to paint an interesting picture. So the National Income Dynamics Study, which was conducted, showed that I think it was over 40% of South Africans, when asked where they last, it definitely is over 40%, I just can't remember the exact figures, it was like 41%, 42% of South Africans, when they were asked where their last consultation was, their last consultation was at a private health provider. It was not via the public healthcare system. And it goes the same for schools. Increasingly, these independent schools like Current, Spark schools, some of them are able to offer at a superior education at a rate that is really similar to what the public education system spends per child, with much better results, of course, because we know that in the public education system, over 50% of the grade 1 cohort is not even matriculating 12 years later. And we also know that 78% of learners, by the time they're in grade 4, cannot read for comprehension in any language, not in English, in any language, even the language that is their mother tongue language. So that's an absolute failure of the public education system. So there's no doubt that the private parallel state is there, and it's being used when available by all South Africans. This is not an elite matter to be discussing. Everyone has an interest in being able to diversify the choices available to them. And often, in fact, that is what separates poor South Africans from rich South Africans. Typically, it's only the wealthy who can escape the mediocrity of the state. So we don't want to create a scenario where only the rich can escape government incompetence. Why should it be that it's only if you're really wealthy that you can pay?
The objective has to be to make sure that more and more people can enjoy the benefits that the few are currently enjoying with the help of this parallel state. Gwen, you mentioned neighborhood watches, and of course that's a big story in resisting some of the looting and preventing loss of more life and more damage in KZN. And the government's response seems to be almost hostile to people protecting themselves. Isn't that very strange, Gwen?
Well, absolutely. In recent, the recent violence in the last few weeks that we've witnessed, it's really community action that has come together to actually deal with the significant effects of the violence and to also deal with the cleanup post the violence. It's only now later on that the relevant ministries are sauntering in on the scene, but really communities had to rely on themselves to protect life and property, which of course it bears mentioning that this should not be the case. I mean, ideally, you don't want to encourage vigilantism or citizens taking the law into their own hands. A state police service, whether operated at the national or a more devolved level of government, has an extensive and important role to play in law enforcement, public order policing, etc. So it is important to bear that in mind, that the reason we criticize its failure is precisely because it should have been on the front lines. Citizens should not have been at the front lines of the violence that was occurring. But when you don't have a police service that can be on the front lines to protect citizens, you cannot leave them destitute. Citizens have to be able to defend themselves. And that's why neighborhood watches have to be enabled and supported to continue to play the very important role that they have been playing.
So, Geordin, to wrap this up, we have a state that is failing, a loss of confidence, and we have a growing sense in the private sector and also just ordinary people, ordinary communities, that they have to do things for themselves. We have to be tolerant of that and enable that, but at the same time, we can't abandon state institutions. We must try and restore the confidence, rebuild those institutions, and do with them what can be done to put South Africa on this higher road. If the DA were to step into government tomorrow, what would the immediate steps of a DA government be to put South Africa back on a high road?
Great question, Cilliers. I think to link to what you and Gwen have just said, the first thing is that we should not treat citizens, citizen bodies, civil society, and importantly business as the enemy, as something that is a threat that should be crushed. Actually, citizen private initiative is what is keeping South Africa going. And those people and their community groups are heroes, and they should be seen as such by their government. And certainly if it were a DA government, that would be our approach, that actually the only way that we are going to fix this country is if we do it together. And that's got to start by understanding that the government's proper role is to make it possible for business owners, for entrepreneurs, for traders to grow the economy and create jobs. And that they are the people that have to do it, and government has a supporting role in making it easier for them to do it, providing them with the infrastructure and the rule of law required to do that. But no one is going to invest when they know that there is no protection of their property, that what we are seeing happening recently could happen to their business. So that is a proper understanding of the role of the state, taking hands with business and with communities and organized, involved citizens to say, let's fix this country. That's the first and most important thing. Then there's a whole swathe of terrible policy that we can get rid of quite quickly. And that's what still makes me optimistic, Cilliers, that there's so much potential in South Africa that can be unlocked reasonably quickly. It's not impossible to change these things. So, stop talking about the expropriation of private property. This is a pointless, distracting discussion that only harms our economy when, if we go through the numbers that Gwen was talking about, this is not even something that the majority of unemployed poor South Africans are worried about. They want a growing economy and a chance to get a job. Stop using empowerment legislation and policy as a means of private enrichment rather than upliftment and economic growth. Sort out the energy economy and unlock the private participation in the energy economy. One could go on through the whole list of so many bad policies, but the bottom line is there's a philosophical approach here that I think is most important, Cilliers. Stop putting obstacles in the way of committed South African citizens and businesses. Rather see your role as government to help facilitate their commitment to our country and provide them with what they need to flourish, and our country will flourish.
Thanks very much, Geordin. Well, there you have it, a shot of hope in the arm. South Africa can be governed differently, and it must be. We'll be back right after this. This week in DA-led towns and cities across the country, the DA-governed Breyten has won Kwela's Dorp van die Jaar competition. Dis 'n DA-ding. The DA-led Western Cape has crossed the 1 million vaccine mark as vaccine rollout continues to pick up pace in the province. And DA-led George has rolled out soup kitchens for more than 8,000 vulnerable children and elderly people. The DA gets things done. Onto this week's DA at Work feature, we speak to Dr. Zahid Badroodien, the City of Cape Town's Mayoral Committee member for Community Services and Health, about the challenges of homelessness in the city. Zahid, welcome to the Inside Track. The problem of homelessness is certainly not unique to Cape Town. There's homelessness in many other cities, towns across South Africa, but it seems in Cape Town it's particularly politicized, which makes it extremely difficult for a government such as yours to deal with. What have you done about people who don't have shelter and homes, and what successes can you show for it?
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's an extremely politicized, extremely complex issue. But I think the City of Cape Town, unlike any other city, has always gone above and beyond what is seen really as a grey or unfunded mandate. We know that street people in the City of Cape Town is a particularly vulnerable group of individuals. This is clearly said in our street people policy, clearly recognized in the conversations we have around housing allocation to try and connect them into second phase housing, etc. But here in the city, we've not only opened up 2 new safe spaces since the beginning of the pandemic, which houses about 400 people alone. We've also supported and worked very closely with a number of our organizations in the city to support them through resources, expanding the existing shelter space and continuing our engagements with the provincial government to try and open up new shelters in the City of Cape Town, because essentially that's the key, to try and connect people to opportunity. But on top of that, again, Cilliers, we got the Street People Program team that on a daily basis engages with, in the past month alone, 1,200 street people, repeat engagements with about 1,800 ongoing people that we work with to try and get them into reintegration, reunification, rehabilitation and other treatment that they require in order to stabilize their lives and support them through a social development approach.
And to address some of those issues that lead to homelessness, of course.
Absolutely, and that's such an important point, because in this umbrella of homelessness, we know that the street people community is increasing. The lockdown has only exacerbated that. People are losing their jobs, people aren't able to buy food, look after their families, people are then moving to the streets, and this is key, because not only does it increase the number of street people we're needing to assist through our social development efforts, but also the number of services that we then need to increase further to cope with the increase in this demand.
Well, you spoke about lockdown. What effect has the lockdown regulations had on the problem of homelessness, but also the problem of land being occupied that is not suitable and safe for human habitation.
Absolutely. And I think, again, unlike any other city, the city of Cape Town is plagued, unfortunately, by a series of court orders at the moment, brought to us by street people themselves, working with other NGOs who are trying to drive an agenda to try and, my opinion, destabilize a good government, a government that delivers, a government that is able to support people through social development approaches. We know that. We've seen the organizations, Ndifuna Kwazi, Human Rights Commission also has brought previously court cases against the city that we're needing to address. What are they trying to do? They're trying to say that it's okay to leave people in our parks, on our streets, sleeping on our benches, in various areas. We as a city of Cape Town are saying that's not okay. We want to get people into shelters, into safe spaces, into services where they can address substance issues, so that holistically we can address the psychosocial demands that they may be facing.
Zahid, lastly, tell me about your Give Dignity campaign. How does it work, and what does Cape Town set out to achieve?
So the Give Dignity campaign is our appeal to residents and businesses to ask them to not give indiscriminately on the streets. We don't want, and by nature Cape Townians are very kind-hearted people, and we don't want them to give money, food, clothing on the streets. We are encouraging them to work with our shelters, work with our safe spaces.
So it's sort of a counterintuitive thing, because people naturally want to give.
Absolutely, and so it's almost a very unnatural ask, but we're encouraging this message, and we're seeing that when we make the spaces available, like our libraries where we've put in drums for people to make donations, we then take that over to shelters and safe spaces. There's a very good response to this. People want to know that their donations are helping an individual, and that their donations are reaching institutions that will use them responsibly. So that's the Give Dignity campaign. But in addition to that, the city has the Winter Readiness Program, where we work with existing shelters. We make funding available to support them with dry ingredients, mattresses, additional blankets, even jobs, to try and employ people through EPWP work so that they have some form of income. This year, we're very grateful that we were able to double the amount of funding that we make available to our shelters. And I say very confidently that the city of Cape Town has an effective street people program approach. We're working continuously with the provincial government, our Minister Shana Fernandez as well. We get lots of visitors previously before COVID-19 to see what our successes are, and we will continue to expand our offer to the vulnerable community in our streets, our street people specifically, so that we can help them more sustainably, instead of just putting them into a shelter and hoping that homelessness or street people crisis will disappear.
And I just want to emphasize an important point is people must give if they can.
Yeah.
And the message seems to be just make sure that you do something more to ensure that what you give helps people in the right way, and that it achieves the...
Absolutely. We're not saying don't give. We know that charity begins at home, as we've heard and as people believe in our own city. We're saying give responsibly. Work through identified facilities, shelters, NGOs that are already engaged with homeless people as part of a greater program to rehabilitate, reintegrate, instead of saying here's a R5 to a parking lot attendant and then causing them to stay in that parking lot because they know that they'll every day get that specific 500 rand from that resident or other residents. We're saying that's not the sustainable way to help street people. We want to holistically, as you've mentioned, focus on gender-based violence issues that may affect them, focus on unemployment or poor education or substance abuse issues that may affect them, so that together in the long term there's a sustainable solution. That is what we propagate in, or we promote in the city of Cape Town through our street people policy, which we're now updating to become the street people strategy, essentially to pull in all of the role players and give them a defined role and responsibility, so that we know who is supposed to do what to help our vulnerable street people community.
Zahid, thanks so much, and good luck with the excellent work that you're doing.
Thank you so much.
We will be back right after this. that's a wrap for this week's episode. With your right to self-defense back in the spotlight after communities were forced to protect themselves in the absence of help from the South African police during the recent riots and looting, it is imperative that we do everything in our power to stop the police minister's disastrous gun bill in its tracks. This bill seeks to take away your right to own a firearm for the purpose of self-defense. Please visit stopgunbill.co.za to join the fight to stop this bill from passing into law. Until next time, stay strong, South Africa.